Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to this Religion Media Centre briefing on the role of religion in relation to Scottish nationalism. It's great to see so many people here, and it's also a delight to be able to introduce the panellists. I'm really looking forward to hearing your reflections on this important topic. Some short introductions. The Rev Dr Doug Gay is the principal of Trinity College at the University of Glasgow. He's also a lecturer in practical theology there, author of many books, including recently one on Christianity and the ethics of nationalism. Dr. Lesley Orr is a research fellow at the Centre for Theology and Public Issues at the University of Edinburgh, and is a historian, a theologian, and an activist for gender and social justice. Imam Sayed Razawi is the Director General of the Scottish Ahlul Bayt Society, and which works to serve the Scottish Shia Muslim community. Dr. Jonathan Chaplin was the first director of the Kirby Lang Institute for Christian Ethics and a member of the Divinity Faculty at the University of Cambridge. He's now an associate fellow at Theos, author of a number of books, including one on faith and democracy, framing a politics of deep diversity. And then Professor Alec Ryrie, who's the Professor of History of Christianity at the University of Durham, author of many books on the history of the Reformation and Protestantism, amongst many other topics. I'd like to begin with a question to each member of the panel, which is simply, why does religion matter in discussions around Scottish nationalism? So why does religion matter in discussions around Scottish nationalism? Just while the panelists are thinking about that question, because they haven't been briefed about the general area of the questions, just to say that I'll be asking questions to begin with, and then there'll be a chance for you to ask questions as well. So why does religion matter in discussions around Scottish nationalism? Doug.
Well, thanks, Jolyon, and great to be here with everyone. I want to suggest there's three angles we could take when we're thinking about the relationship between religion and Scottish nationalism, three broad ones. And I suppose we could think from the perspective of religion in relation to theology and ethics. So we could use theology and ethics to form a kind of normative and critical perspective on nationalism. In my own work, for example, I've focused on the ethics of nationalism, of whether nationalism is an intrinsically unethical phenomenon, or whether there are ways of defining nationalism which can allow a more neutral and open framing, and then you can bring various ethical, theological, critical tests to it. So that's the first sense, is theology, if you like, as a normative and critical perspective on nationalism. The second angle I would suggest comes from religious studies, in the sense in which we look at the role of religion in relation to nationalism as a social and political phenomenon. So how far has nationalism of different kinds had religious motivations and invoked religious metaphors, religious ideas, suggested, for example, where the proponents of a nationalism suggested, for example, they have divine sanction or approval for their project. And I suppose the third way in which I think this is relevant would be to look more specifically at, speaking as a Christian theologian, at church history, but we could also say more generally at religious history and say, how can we see in Scotland, for example, the ways in which there have been interactions between the story of the church and the story of the nation. And we can trace that at all kinds of levels, from the ways in which, going right back to the Declaration of Arbroath, it invoked religious ideas about God's guidance on the Scottish people, all the way through, say, to the 19th century, where George Davies' book, The Democratic Intellect, argued that Scotland didn't have a normal development of nationalist sentiment because the disruption kind of diverted and sublimated all these religious energies in the 19th century into religious disputes, when other European nations were developing what he saw as a healthy and normal national consciousness. So theology and ethics, religious studies, and church history, I would suggest, are three ways in which we can explore this relationship between religion and nationalism.
Thanks, Jolyon, and thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this panel today. Yeah, I concur with the way in which Doug has laid out the kind of areas or the headings under which we might consider this question. Looking more particularly now at Scotland and Scottish history and the kind of the political development of Scotland and the role of religion in that. I think I would want to speak about, you know, the particular role of the Reformation in Scotland and the social consequences of the Reformation in shaping a particular kind of culture that connected with not just with ethics and morals, but a sense of the common good and of collective responsibility, and the way in which the particular kind of Reformation that we had in Scotland led to perhaps, as people have sometimes suggested, a more collective, perhaps possibly, you know, this is subject to debate, of course, but possibly a more egalitarian outlook or perspective that has shaped Scottish history since the Reformation, and the particular role of the way in which Protestantism became very strongly identified as what it meant to be Scottish, that, you know, what it meant to be the Scottish nation was, in fact, you know, that Protestantism was absolutely central to that in a kind of covenanted sense. And then, you know, latterly into modern history, you know, how the growth of the end of persecution of Catholicism in Scotland, and the mass immigration of the 19th century and the development of Irish, particularly Irish Catholic communities in Scotland, and the links, you know, those continuing links with the politics and culture and identity questions in Ireland, how those have kind of played into some of the developments around Scotland and identity. And then finally for now, I think it's very important to look in our recent history, and of course the revival of nationalism as a central political concept in Scotland, and how that's connected with, first of all, secularization in Scotland, and secondly, the changing pattern of religious affiliation, and the fact that we are now a much more multi-faith, multicultural, diverse society. And I think a lot of these factors, you know, have shaped the current state of play that we're in now.
Thank you very much. It's quite an interesting conversation so far. I want to look at it more from a practical basis, being engaged with the community. And I think it's important, firstly, to say that there is, well, in this evolving world, we're not divorced from what's taking place in Europe and other parts of the world. And you see a rise of two things. You see a rise of various types of nationalism. Each one of them are very unique. So if one was to take the example of English nationalism, it's different in many ways from Scottish nationalism. And hence, I guess nationalism, whether it's secular nationalism within Europe, has its own context. But I think the second thing is that we're living in a world which is becoming deeply religious, or increasing in its religiosity. And we've seen that with government responses, let's say, for example, the COVID crisis. There's not a week that goes by that we don't have 2 meetings at least amongst faith leaders with the government. So in the last 11 to 12 months, and this wouldn't have been possible maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So there's an involvement of people of faith more and more so within Scottish society, which is a lot more actually than English society at the moment. So with that in mind, I guess there is a unique form of nationalism in Scotland, and its uniqueness is really social and political. It's a freedom movement of emancipation. And this is why, I guess, when you look at some of the more minority communities, minority faiths, you'll find that especially within this election, many of them have taken the route of Scottish nationalism because they feel one with the people. And I guess this is something which is unique. The only place you find that is in the United States. You certainly don't find that in England, and you don't find that across Europe. So there is a unique nationalism within Scotland, which is appealing to people of faith, the minority faiths, and that combined with the larger communities. So speaking to our colleagues from both the Protestant and the Catholic denominations, or even the Episcopalians, you do find a rise now in nationalism, which is very historic. You just got to go to Glasgow on a Friday night, Saturday night, you do see some of that history coming through, but now there's more of an awareness of that history. So I guess it's multifaceted, but Scotland is very unique. And I think the uniqueness is history combined with socio-political movements, combined with a rise in religiosity. And its very unique dimension in terms of its really movement of emancipation, which is appealing a lot more to minority faith communities and the believers of those minority faith communities.
Thank you, and thanks very much for having me here, even though I'm not based in Scotland or Scottish or an expert on Scotland. So I'll just assume the modest task of speaking for England, see how that goes. But perhaps some just general reflections about the range of possible relationships between religion and nationhood and nationalism to help maybe situate parts of our discussion. I mean, historically, in Christianity especially, but in all faiths, there is a huge spectrum of different kinds of relationships that have emerged, and some persisted for centuries, some very short-lived, some very peaceful and constructive, and others incredibly destructive and damaging for both sides. But you could distinguish at least, 4 different possible models here. There's, on one side of the spectrum, there's kind of a fusion between, let's say, church, if I can just speak out of the Christian tradition here, church and nation, where the two are seen as, if not identical, at least coterminous, as in, say, the English thinker Richard Hooker, which has fed into England's religious self-understanding and is not entirely dead. On the other side, opposition, where the two are simply at complete loggerheads with each other under communist regimes, atheistic regimes, and so forth, and where the church is a persecuted or marginalized minority, and where it simply has no sense of identification with the dominant nation because it's sees it as the oppressor. More common in Europe in the last few centuries, of course, has been establishment, where there's an intimate tie between a particular church tradition, or perhaps more than one, and the nation as represented through the state. So this would lead to various kinds of constitutional privileging of a particular denomination or confession. And I think, what we face in the UK is that all 4 nations of the UK are in different ways struggling with living through post-establishment tensions and complexities in very different ways. Of course, the Church of England, the Anglican churches in Ireland and Wales were disestablished a long time ago. That only happened, of course, in Scotland with the Church of Scotland in 1921, formally speaking. In England, of course, we still have an established Church of England, which still continues to substantially frame England's understanding of the relation between religion and nationhood, in spite of extensive secularization. So each of these trajectories of post-establishment, some would call it post-Christendom, profoundly shapes the different contexts. And we have to take this into account if we're to figure out where we are today and where we might go in the future. And the fourth is, what you might call respectful cooperation, where there is a formal distinction between church and nation, no longer any privileged constitutional ties. Of course, there are vestigial ties in Scotland, in the sense that the Church of Scotland is still regarded as a national church in a rather weak sense, but not the same as in England. So, but where there's a distinction between the two, and yet there has come to be, various forms of cooperation in a variety of ways: civic cooperation, cooperation in the delivery of public services, for example, and so forth. And you see that replicated in different ways, of course, across a number of European post-establishment nations. And I think, looking to the future, the challenge is always going to be, in Scotland, as in England and elsewhere, is what is the structure of that cooperation? What are the possibilities that exist that we could appropriate? And what are the trajectories now towards a more respectful cooperation in a context of increasing pluralism and multi-faithism and multiculturalism?
Thank you so much. Perhaps if I could, Doug, if you could just, before we turn to Alec, you've got a quick point you wanted to make in response to Jonathan's point there.
Yeah, and this is a bit of a chestnut, but I'm not sure I would agree with Jonathan that the Church of Scotland is accurately described as disestablished. I think it's a rather now there's other people who may have different views on this who are very expert on this call as well, but I don't think that that's what happened in the 1920s with the Church of Scotland. So I would say that in terms of the Act of Union, and that's all clearly very important in terms of what we're thinking about at the moment, that the Articles Declaratory and the agreement, the Church of Scotland Act in the 1920s, I don't think they set aside the provisions in the Act of Union. I think what they represent is a decision on the part, as the price of a peace deal between the Free Church and the Church of Scotland, a decision by the churches largely themselves to stop using the language of establishment to describe their position. So you'll find that people in the contemporary Church of Scotland are very reluctant to describe themselves as an established church because of that legacy. But I would argue that in significant ways, the Church of Scotland was never disestablished. And I don't think that's what happened in the 1920s. So it's differently established in the Church of England, but I don't think it's correct for me to say it's disestablished.
Thank you. Alec, just returning to the opening question of why religion matters in discussions around Scottish nationalism.
Sure, thank you. Well, I mean, much of what I might want to cover from a historical point of view has already been said, but two ways of approaching that question that seem to me important. So I just want to talk a little bit about identity and then a little bit about culture, political culture particularly. Religion has been a primary form in which Scottish identity has been understood and expressed through a series of stages, and in particular how the national question in most nations, but maybe especially in Scotland, has always been about relations with neighbours, especially the big awkward neighbour to the immediate south, but also with the wider European world. So for medieval Scotland, its Catholic identity, its identity as a special daughter of the Pope, was a central part of how the nation conceived of itself. Doug mentioned the Declaration of Arbroath, the pious framing for that. It's the kind of approach that lies behind James IV's famously disastrous invasion of England in 1513. What makes the moment of the Scottish Reformation in 1559-60 so pivotal is this is the point where Scotland makes this extraordinarily quick and unexpected jump in its professed collective religious identity, and embraces a Protestant identity to a remarkable extent, and at the same time abandons its long-standing pro-French, anti-English orientation and enters into this deep and progressively deepening alliance with England, which is then cemented further by the Union of Crowns and ultimately by the Union of Parliaments, the creation of the British state. That is, as has often been said, an identity which is made possible by and built on shared Protestantism, even if the sharing of the Protestantism is never all that close. But especially during the period of the British Wars in the 1640s, the extent to which both sides of the border are staring enviously at each other's religion, and the influences that are running across them become very strong. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing the ties of that British state unraveling at the same point as the Protestant culture that had defined it is receding on both sides of the border, and with this a much more secularist and pluralist set of norms becoming dominant. And the other element of that identity that I would put into the mix is the resurgence of European identity as a a receptacle for Scottish. I mean, the point where Scottish nationalism as a political movement has really taken off is when it's embraced its pro-European identity, and of course the way that Brexit has quite likely given the nationalist movement the extra push that it needs to get over the edge. There's a return to a degree of there's an echo of the old Catholic position here, in which embracing a European identity, it is now a secular European identity, in opposition to what was distinctive about Britishness is one of the factors at play here. So there's a whole identity part of the story.
Thank you.
On the cultural side, just very quickly, and this is echoing some of what Lesley was saying. I think there is something really distinctive in Scottish political culture that comes out of the Reformation and the way that has shaped Scottish public discourse. It picks up on older features of Scottish political life, the importance of bonds and covenants, the pretty weak culture of law in medieval Scotland as compared to that in England. But the fact that the Scottish Reformation is a bottom-up process, or if not bottom-up, it's at least forced on a reluctant crown. And we were discussing just now to what extent the Church of Scotland was disestablished. I think there's a case which you can never really ask to what extent it was established in the first place. It's never fully brought in to the state and domesticated, despite repeated attempts to do so. It's James VI who first starts accusing, and very much an accusation, some of his ministers of plotting a democratic form of government. And that sense of, if not egalitarianism, certainly of deep suspicion of political authority, and willingness to organize against it is a thread that runs through Scottish political culture in a way that it does not south of the border. I think a lot of that can be traced down to that sort of mulish awkwardness of a Calvinist identity.
Thank you. Now, picking up a number of threads that have been identified, perhaps we could just ask one question which a number of people have highlighted to me before the discussion, which some people have said that Scottish nationalism, particularly separatist Scottish nationalism, has actually become more important than religious faith and religious identity. And I just received an email just before we went live from a professor down south asking a question, if anyone can answer this, in relation to, is there any hard data establishing a correlation or a link between the rise of Scottish separatist nationalism and the decline of the Church of Scotland? So be very interested to hear your responses to this, but particularly to think about, is there a sense in which certain strands of Scottish nationalism, particularly separatist Scottish nationalism, has become like a religion or replaced a religion? Lesley.
Thanks for that, Jolyon.
It's a pleasure.
Depending on how you look at the evidence, I mean, some people have traced a correlation between the decline, the precipitous decline of the Church of Scotland and religious affiliation to the Church of Scotland, and a pro-independence stance. I think that's different from saying it has become, the way you've asked the question, it kind of sounds like, has nationalism, has separatism become a new form of religion? And I would certainly dispute that. I think that's the story is a much more complex one than that. If you look at the last census, the 2011 census figures, or the 2012 social attitude survey, and then you kind of correlate that with how the vote went in the 2014 independence referendum, it is kind of clear in those terms that people who identified as Protestant, as Church of Scotland possibly, but as the major religious tradition in Scotland, were much more likely to vote no than the other kind of main categories. So, for example, in the referendum, I can't remember what the actual figures are. I think it was about 40% Protestants, declared Protestants voted yes. 57% of Catholics voted yes, and about 56% of folk who had no religion. But the fact that no religion is such a much bigger category in the Scottish population now does suggest that as time has gone on, and as support for independence and for independence has increased, that matches with the decline of people identifying as Protestant. Michael Rosey suggests that's more to do with age than anything else. That the Catholic population much more closely matches the general population in Scotland, whereas the Church of Scotland particularly, and Protestants more generally, are very much an ageing population in Scotland. So, if you want to unpick those figures in different ways, you can do. Other people would say that it's not just the age factor, that there are other things going on there. And that, the link between Protestantism and unionism, perhaps, if you particularly want to investigate the more kind of Orange Order style of unionism, the kind of working class populist unionism. Has there been a decline there? Is that a factor? I think these things are just much more complicated than the question suggests.
Alec, would you like to add anything from your perspective as an expert on Protestantism?
Well, once we get into the 20th century, I'm uneasy. But I didn't know those stats that Lesley just gave us about the religious differentials that can be deduced from the 2014 referendum, but that absolutely makes sense to me. It's nice when somebody produces data that fit with what my prejudices would have been. That Protestantism has been deeply woven into the British project from the beginning. It's of course implicated in a slightly different way, but maybe not as differently as we might imagine, in the Irish Union. And that retreat into secularism, or the emergence of a different set of secular ethics, seems to me fundamental to this process. As I said just now, I would put the value placed on the European Union and on European identity as an alternative to a Protestant identity as part of this. And again, perhaps for self-professed Protestants, that's not such an easily embraced one as for Catholics, obviously, and for those who see themselves identifying as no religion, for whom a European identity is very obviously appealing one. It's not a straightforwardly religious category, but
thank you.
I think there's overtones
Alec,
there.
thank you. That's great. I've got Doug waving at me, so Doug.
Yeah, just a couple of questions, a couple of points. One is, which Jock has also made this point in the chat, but separatist is not a neutral word in this conversation, Jolyon, so it tends to be seen as a unionist attack word, whereas nationalists would use the term self-determination. So, using it alongside Scottish nationalism is slightly confusing, I think, in that sense.
Yeah, thank you. That was the question that was sent in.
Sure, no, I understand that. Yeah. I'm not applying that to you, but to your questioner. I just wanted to maybe highlight for folks on the call that this narrative about I mean, I came across a quote the other day when the Alex Salmond said he who must not be mentioned anymore said a book signing that history would show that Catholics voted yes in 2014 and Protestants voted no. Now that's a very blunt summary, but the tendencies are the ones that Lesley described in the data, and that's accurate. But I think what's important for people to understand is how, in a sense, that is a kind of fairly novel twist to the narrative about how those communities might have been seen, where their political allegiances might have been seen to lie. So I would say up until maybe the 1990s and maybe even later, there was this very strong sense that Scottish Catholics were aligned with Labour, the Labour Party, and unionism, and that had historically, there'd been very close ties there. But not only that, there was suspicion that Scottish nationalism was a Protestant project and that the Scottish nation was defined as this Knoxian Presbyterian nation. And so what you get when this begins to flip is really quite striking. And I remember in 2014 when I was launching my book on nationalism and taking great pains to consider the ethics of nationalism, Rosanna Cunningham, who's just retired as a Scottish minister and is a prominent Catholic in Scotland within the nationalist movement, turned to me and said, I don't know why you Protestants are so hung up about nationalism. It's not really an issue for us. And I think she was looking back in particular to the relationship between the Catholic community, the modern Catholic community in Scotland and Ireland. In other words, if modern Scottish Catholics, I think that there was this clarification almost that at the end of the 20th century, if they'd made their peace with Irish independence and with Irish nationalism in that sense, then why should they have a problem with Scottish nationalism? And Cardinal Keith Brown, I think, famously said that the Catholic Church in Scotland was relaxed about the prospect of independence.
Again, I think that's just to make that differentiation between Scottish nationalism and separatism in and of itself. You know, you've had the mention of the Orange Order. You go to Glasgow and you see the Order of St. Columba as well. So you have multiple different, I would say, organizations or things would be, I would say, part of the tapestry of Scotland, orders which are religiously orientated, which actually would claim to be nationalistic in their approach. So I think separatism is different from nationalism, but coming post-Brexit and how much of Scottish, I would say, tendencies towards Europe is actually a vote against the union is also a question I would put forward. Again, the idea of identity politics and the culture of Scotland, which is ever evolving. You know, we're looking at Christianity, but there are also other faiths in Scotland which have taken now a more separatist nationalistic route. So I think there's a number of things here that I think needs to be analysed, but I would like to go deeper into the whole idea of what is Scottish nationalism, because I feel for different groups it's different things. You know, you go to practicing people at the Trades House in Glasgow, let's say, who are practicing Christians, they have a different form of nationalism to if you were to go to the Merchant House in Edinburgh, for example, who again you'd find many of them are practicing Christians, but who would have a different understanding of nationalism, and it differs, I find, when you go from Edinburgh to Glasgow. So, and these are with the establishments or part organisations who have been part of an established organisation which could date back to 400 or 500 years. So really, that's my question I'd like to put forward. Actually, that how can we define Scottish nationalism, and is it different from Scottish separatist nationalism?
Perhaps just a brief comment about secularization. So, you know, the relation between processes of secularization and the resurgence of nationalism or senses of national identity is, you know, hugely complex and differentiated across many different regions. So, you know, in Quebec, for example, in the 1960s, it's pretty widely understood that the sudden secularization of Quebec in the 1960s led to a definite spike in nationalism. That's fairly well established, but you know, in other contexts, that relationship doesn't apply in the same way at all. So you know, there's no generic relationship here that can be seen in every setting. It's case by case analysis that's required. But more broadly on secularization, I think I'd say this: that if we're asking the question, how to identify religion as an independent variable in relation to nationalism, whether supportive of it or critical of it, we have to ask what we mean by, by religion. I mean, so religion in many of these settings, given extensive secularization, I mean, the whole of the UK is extensively secularized. Religion functions very indirectly as part of a sort of ongoing cultural memory. So that, for example, in England, as you'll all be aware, still roughly, I don't know, 50% of the population, when asked point blank, will identify as Anglican in some way, or Christian at least, Christian, not Anglican. But probably 3/4 of that at least by that people mean a sort of cultural identity rather than any religious commitment, which is not to judge it in any way. It's just to try to deconstruct it. So what is driving the correlations here? I mean, we must distinguish between correlations and causations. And as far as I can see, the majority of those who identify as Christian in England, at least, determine their political views on things like nationalism largely independently of the substance of their faith, certainly independently of the ethical and political teachings that their leaders would like them to embrace. And that gulf is particularly stark in the Church of England right now, where a recent survey suggests that only 6-7% of the clergy voted Conservative in a recent election, whereas those who identify as Anglican and more broadly, that figure would be either comparable with the general population or much higher. So what do we mean by religion here? Do we mean the specific teachings and sort of practices of a particular tradition, a particular religious tradition? Or do we simply mean a lingering cultural memory that still won't quite fully die?
Jonathan, thank you. That's very helpful. I'm aware that time is ticking by, and I'm wondering if there are a number of questions. I've seen Jock, Steve, you had a question which a number of people have picked up. Said, you referenced it, and so did Doug as well.
I think I've really put it, and Doug has amplified it.
Okay.
Separatist has become rather a unionist label, and I would like to see Scottish nationalism perhaps distinguished more from patriotism, which I think is something which unionists like to think that they are. Perhaps that might be an interesting question for debate.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can we hold that question and alongside Rosie's? Rosie, I think you've got a question as well. So thank you, Jock.
Yes, I mean, as a journalist, it has been almost impossible, I find, to find religious leaders in Scotland who support the union. Now, I know that obviously they're going to be very careful about what they say in public, but colleagues who've been trying to find these people, they're just drawing a complete blank. And I am wondering why you think that is.
I'd like to respond.
Or is it just they don't trust journalists to not break confidences?
Well, my reflection on this, from what I know of the debate here and the people in religious leadership, is really this is not so much to do essentially with nationalism, the question of nationalism. It's to do with the question of values and principles, the kind of key issues that religious leaders or that faith traditions want to uphold and have seen being so fundamentally undermined and challenged by the state of Westminster politics and what's been happening, with austerity, the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers, questions about poverty, and there's so many kind of social justice issues that I think are very important for faith communities, and the European, membership of the European Union, and we've spoken a little bit about that identity. So again, this is a complicated question, and Doug may disagree with me about this, but I do think that people south of the border misinterpret the nature of the debate and the political developments in Scotland and think they're primarily about questions of nationalism and identity. And I really don't think that is the case. I think, you know that I'm involved in an organisation called Women for Independence. It's a non-party, non-aligned movement, fairly grassroots movement, and most of the people in that in our movement were not particularly politically active or motivated. Not that many of them were kind of, are being cradle nationalists or, involved in Scottish nationalism for a long time. But what they do see is that they believe, and they're increasingly developing a kind of rationale for being a small, responsible nation, in the kind of global citizen with the civic nationalism kind of approach, and believing that self-determination and Scottish independence is our best hope for developing into that kind of nation, a nation that's built around, rights and equality and so on. So,
Lesley, thank you so much.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
That's great. Don't apologise. It's great. Catherine Peppister, I think you have a question. Doug, I will come to you in a moment. Catherine.
Yes, thanks, Jolyon. I wondered if people could comment on the extent to which faith leaders and nationalist politicians make an effort to actually cultivate one another, with consequences at the polling stations. I'm asking that because I'm aware, because of things I've written about in the past, the extent to which there were definitely strong mutual relationships developed that were mutually beneficial between first Cardinal Thomas Winning and later Cardinal Keith O'Brien with Alex Salmond, that both Winning and O'Brien felt that Salmond might deliver on issues that really mattered to them. To some extent, he did, in others he didn't. And we have seen the consequences of that, particularly for Labour, in terms of where the Catholic votes ended up. And I wonder if the nationalists are attempting to have these kind of professional relationships with other faiths. I mean, the historian Tom Devine suggests that what's actually happened is that Catholics went mainstream, so then they just behaved as other mainstream Scots would. Maybe that's what we'll see with other faiths. But I'm just interested in this.
Doug.
Yeah, I just want to reply very, very briefly to Rosie's question as well, which was just to say that I think part of this is just, I'm a pastoral theologian and a minister, and part of this is just a pastoral issue, Rosie, that people experienced how divisive the 2014 referendum was. And Scotland was split down the middle. And so I think that faith leaders and church leaders have been very conscious of a pastoral responsibility to both sides. And so I think, often they don't come out strongly in one way or another because they are trying to look after a divided flock. But just to come back to the question that Catherine asked then, I think clearly Alex Salmond, and his fall from grace has been so spectacular in some ways, it's interesting that it feels odd to talk about him seriously anymore in Scotland in some ways for me, but he clearly was a very serious figure in the not too distant past. And I think, Catherine, he made a conscious effort to try and overcome what was, I think, seen within the SNP as Catholic opposition to nationalism. So he made a conscious attempt to build bridges, and Rosanna Cunningham and others, prominent Catholics within the SNP, were important within that. And part of that was also indicating that there was no threat to Catholic education in Scotland. So that was one of the things, just as the SNP has tried to disarm significant areas of opposition. So they've tried to keep the Republican wing quiet by saying they're not intending to get rid of the Queen. And then they've tried to also build bridges with the Catholic community by saying we're not against Catholic education.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah. Andrew Brown, a question from Andrew.
I'm interested in this in the role of English religious nationalism. As somebody was saying earlier, the way that self-identified, if hardly church-going Anglicans vote is a hell of a long way away from the way that the hierarchy have it. But there is very clearly a a groundswell of self-identified Anglicanism, which seems to me, and this is really what I'm asking, whether it seems to anybody else, is likely to accelerate the push factor of Scottish nationalism. These are people who feel that Scots are foreigners, and if they want to go away, well, let them. Do you think this is likely to be a serious factor as things develop?
Sayed, would you like to say anything in relation to this question or the questions that come up?
Just to touch on the question on faith, religious leaders, I think being critical of policy doesn't always mean or imply that you're separatist. I would agree with what Doug said. The vast majority of religious leaders, faith leaders in Scotland, would be balancing act between those people who are separatist and otherwise. But at the same time, I think Scottish nationalism is more egalitarian in many ways. English nationalism is I would say in many ways treats minorities as the other, whereas within Scotland, there is no ethnic divide, similar to the United States, whereby if you're American, you're American. If you've got your passport 2 days before and you say you're an American, 2 days after you're an American. Similarly in Scotland, if I say I'm Scottish, I could have a London accent, but it doesn't matter. I am Scottish for all intents and purposes. And I think that if I look at some of our colleagues, friends, relatives in London, let's say, who are third generation English, they will always be seen as the other. And I think that that is a success by the SNP. And that's something that Alex Salmond, knowing him very closely, was able to do, to make those bridges, which unfortunately within England have not been made. And you will see more of a divide in England going forward.
Lesley, I don't know if I saw you nodding there. I don't know if you want to make a quick response to Andrew Brown's question, or.
Yeah, I do think that's having an impact on the conversation in Scotland and on opinion in Scotland. We see this increasing divergence really in the political cultures and political responses in Scotland and England. If you think, post-Thatcher and the decline, the disintegration of the Labour Party as a kind of mass movement for working class voters. And, well, I better not go into all the politics of that. But I think that the fact that in Scotland, the response or the alternative space was occupied by the SNP, clearly setting its stall out as a left of centre party and drawing some of that to it, and increasingly so because of various factors that were at play. Whereas in England, the response has been to head off to tack to the right, really. And for working class voters, the red wall is now, the wall that favours Brexit and so on. And the kind of the whole discourse around Englishness and all that was generated through Brexit and so on. I can't remember who I heard saying the other day or read that, in the end, it could be English nationalism that destroys the union. And I think there's some truth in that. I really do. I think there's a lot of anxiety about it.
Thank you so much. We've got time for one more question, I think. Ted Harrison.
My thought was that if one looks at the role of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, once the Scottish Parliament was established, its role then was, it was over. And perhaps the baton of nationalism has been handed on to the secular movements. That was the moment it happened in Scotland. In other places, for instance, in Wales, it was the chapels that kept the language and the identity going. But once that became a secular movement, then they declined. So really what I'm asking is, has the baton of nationalism, which was kept alive, nationalism was kept alive by the churches, now been firmly passed on to the secular movements?
And we are a bit tight for time. So.
Sure. Well, very quickly, 1707, Ted, there was 3 pillars of national identity which survived the Union settlement. So the law, education, and the churches. And so for a long time, it was said that the Church's General Assembly acted as a surrogate parliament in the absence of a Scottish parliament. And so there is what you're saying, I think there is something to that, in that the way in which it was compensating for a democratic deficit that has gone from 1999 with the arrival of the Scottish Parliament. yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Now, I notice there's one very quick follow-up question from Catherine, which is simply to say, I did ask about whether this cultivation is happening with other faith groups, and nobody answered that. So, Sayed, would you like to have a go in 1 minute to respond to that, please?
So I didn't get the question. What's
Catherine,
happening with faith groups?
Other faith groups,
Yeah.
are they being cultivated in the similar way that was discussed in relation to Catholicism and Protestantism?
Yes. As in one word, yes, they are.
Okay, that's fine. Well, I found this a fascinating conversation. Thank you to everyone for your questions. This conversation is clearly going to run and run and run. And thank you to each of you who've sent in questions. I've noticed Stephen Patterson sent one in, Julia Bicknell as well. So thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we don't have time to go into depth in answering. I've found several of the questions I'll be thinking about for the rest of the week, and many of the answers the same. But I want to say on behalf of us all a huge thank you to Ollie for the technical help, for Ruth for organising, but also to our panellists who've joined us today. Thank you so much for giving up your time. Doug Gay, Lesley Orr, Sayed Razawi, Jonathan Chaplin, Alec Ryrie. Thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't already been part of the network, please do sign up. You'll get lots of other briefings, opportunities to come to these events, but also lots of fact sheets and so on. And Ruth can tell you more details about that. But thank you so much for joining us. We're just coming up to the end of the hour, but thanks again. And I hope to see you again at another event that the Religion Media Centre will be running.